Welcome everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today to take part in this discussion that is very near and dear to many of our hearts. My name is Tony Quintana. I'm the Plant-Based Eating Program Manager for Animal Protection of New Mexico. Since 1979, Animal Protection New Mexico has been advocating for animals by effecting systemic change, working towards the humane treatment of all animals. Our Promoting Plant-Based Eating program works to raise awareness of how our food choices impact all animals, humans, the environment, and our personal health. We provide free resources to help people make changes in their diets and work to make plant-based foods more accessible to New Mexicans. We are honored to be co-hosting this event. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our co-host.
Hi, everybody. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. We want to especially welcome any elected officials that have been able to join the panel discussion. And today's discussion is hosted by the New Mexico Citizens Dairy Coalition. And if you're not familiar with our group, the coalition was formed in 2009 as the public element and voice in developing specific groundwater discharge regulations with the dairy industry and Groundwater Quality Bureau of the New Mexico Environment Department. And the coalition is made up of a group of diverse organizations, that is Interfaith Worker Justice, Animal Protection of New Mexico, Amigos Bravos, Sierra Club Rio Grande Chapter, the Mesquite Community Action Committee, Socially Responsible Agriculture Project, and Food and Water Watch. And I'm Margaret Wadsworth. I'm the senior organizer with Food and Water Watch here in New Mexico. And today we are going to talk about how the practice of concentrating cows at Mega-Dairies has caused concentrated problems in southern New Mexico, including excessive water pollution, swarms of flies, terrible smells, and all of these problems have plagued New Mexico communities for decades. And after over a decade of working on water quality monitoring, it is still unclear how much pollution is being discharged by the dairy industry in southern New Mexico. So we're here to learn from experts and community leaders about their work. And we're also here to start a discussion about what we can do about this problem, including future legislative actions that will require your support and your help. So we are very sorry that due to an emergency, Dr. Ray Powell will not be able to join us, but we are really grateful that Kathy Martin, a hydrological engineer who has worked with the New Mexico Citizens Dairy Coalition for many years, will be joining us with a presentation. So I will be announcing our three panelists and in just a second. So our first panelist is Maria Elena Bejarano. And this is a photo of Maria Elena and Betty Gonzalez of Anthony, New Mexico. And they have been involved with the New Mexico Citizens Dairy Coalition since day one. And both women have served as representatives of affected communities at the legislature and during the stakeholder process of the dairy rule and during the review of the Doña Ana dairy abatement process. And both Maria Elena and Betty give voice to the concerns of their neighbors in their community, as well as to so many other negatively impacted communities they've worked with for comprehensive environmental regulations of the New Mexico dairy industry. And our next speaker is Kathy Martin, who has worked with the coalition for the past 10 years on dairy issues in New Mexico and was also involved in the dairy rule process and more recently, the review of the Doña Ana dairy abatement process. And Kathy is a petroleum engineer and she has a master's in civil engineering from the University of Oklahoma. And she has spent the past, well, more than 20 years helping communities understand regulations and permitting with respect to concentrated animal feeding operations, such as the ones here in New Mexico. And finally, our last speaker is Michael Jensen, who has 15 years experience with New Mexico water policy, regulatory and legal issues, and he represented Amigos Bravos as a stakeholder in the first dairy rule to protect groundwater, co-coordinating communities for clean water, and worked with Multicultural Alliance for a Safe Environment. And Michael's done this extensive work here in New Mexico, and including in Albuquerque, where he conducted a 2-year water quality monitoring project in the drains and ditches along the Rio Grande, documenting the presence of pharmaceuticals and endocrine disrupting compounds, and worked with the South Valley community organizations and neighborhoods to hold a series of green infrastructure to manage stormwater runoff, and participated in year-long national diversity, equity, and inclusion project with organizations representing stormwater impacted environmental justice communities. So Michael's a very familiar face in New Mexico in regards to water policy and work at a state level, and also at the neighborhood level. So anyways, without further ado, I would like to introduce Maria Elena, our first speaker, who's going to be telling us about how Mega-Dairies are impacting communities in southern New Mexico. Thanks, Maria Elena.
Hi, my name is Maria Elena Bejarano. I have lived in the Anthony, New Mexico area since a time when dairies were not such a huge presence in our town. I was here when the invasion of flies into town began. I was here when the foul smells from the dairies hadn't really lowered our quality of life every day. I was here when the water pollution from the dozen or so dairies that are perched on the northern and eastern edge of town was not so far above safe and allowable standards that those dairies had to join together with a plan to monitor the advance of their pollution plume towards and within Anthony. And we all hope watch the pollution levels decrease to safe levels as the dairies' polluted discharge blended with cleaner groundwater. I worry every day about the health risks and lower quality of life that my children and grandchildren face. Anthony is a dairy industry town now, and while they provide employment, the consequences of their huge presence has cost my town and its residents dearly. Hola, mi nombre es Maria Elena Bejarano. He vivido aquí en el área de Anthony, Nuevo México, desde que las lecherías no tenían tan gran presencia en nuestro pueblo. Yo estaba aquí cuando la invasión de moscas llegó al pueblo. Yo estaba aquí cuando los malos olores de las lecherías todavía no bajaban nuestra calidad de vida. Yo estaba aquí cuando la contaminación del agua de unas 12 o más lecherías que están encaramadas al norte y al este, al límite del pueblo, subieron tan arriba de los niveles seguros y estándares permitidos que esas lecherías se unieron con el plan de monitorear el avance de su pluma de contaminación hacia y dentro de Anthony, y esperemos que el nivel de esta contaminación baje a un nivel sano cuando la descarga contaminada de estas lecherías se combina con agua subterránea más limpia. Me preocupo todos los días por los riesgos para la salud y menor calidad de mi vida, de mis hijos y nietos que ellos enfrentan. Anthony es un pueblo de maquilas de lecherías, y mientras ellas proporcionan empleo, las consecuencias de su gran presencia aquí ha sido al costo caro del pueblo y sus residentes. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Elena. And go ahead and introduce our second panelist, Kathy Martin.
Hey, thank you very much. So I think we're going to, my name is Kathy Martin. I'm actually in Norman, Oklahoma, but I've been working on issues in New Mexico for some time. Tony, if you want to put the slide on to some basic information. Hopefully everybody can hear me really well. Yes, no? Okay, so dairies in New Mexico are regulated by the New Mexico Environment Department. You can go on their website. They have an entire webpage about dairies if you're interested in learning more about the permitting process. According to dairy industry, there's about 130 dairy facilities in New Mexico, mostly on the eastern border between New Mexico and Texas, and also in the southern areas south of Las Cruces. So you're looking at areas around Roswell, Clovis, Las Cruces, for the most part. And the main counties that are hosting these dairies are Chavez, Roosevelt, Curry, Dona Ana, and Lea counties. So the size of a dairy is indicative of maybe how much negative impact pollution-wise, right? And New Mexico has an interesting statistic. They do have some of the largest average size dairies at 2,300 head. Now, these are not the largest dairies in the United States, and I have worked in about 23 different states on CAFO issues. There are some dairies, of course, in California that are 40,000 head. There's some in Wisconsin that are 8,000 head. But for the most part, New Mexico, most of their dairies are about 2,000 to 4,000 head. Interesting fact on permitting dairies, New Mexico is the only state that does not ask for the number of head of cattle or head of dairy cows in their permit application form. Every other state, it's one of the first things that is asked for on the permit form. So truly, NMED does not know how many actual cows are on each facility that they regulate. And that's going to be one of our issues we want to remedy at the end of our talk. All of the dairies in New Mexico are housed outdoors on a dirt feedlot versus the kind of dairies you might see in northern United States where they're inside freestall barns. These are all outdoors. And a lot of the milk that's generated is sent to two cheese factories, Southwest Cheese and Leprino Foods. But there are also about a half dozen milk processing plants in New Mexico as well. Okay, next slide. Just to get an understanding of what's going on in a dairy, my background is civil engineering or environmental engineering. So I'm very interested in the wastewater management at livestock facilities. So when we look at dairies, especially on open feedlot, the type of wastewater we're talking about is different than in other parts of the country. So the first obvious thing is if you have animals defecating on dirt feedlots, that any contaminated stormwater runoff would be a pollutant. Obviously in New Mexico, there's not a lot of stormwater, but when there is during monsoon season, then of course the runoff is of particular interest and concern. The main type or daily wastewater that's generated on a dairy is from cleaning the milking parlor. So the cows are brought into the parlor, they're milked several times a day, depending on the operator. And so of course there's going to be some defecation and urine on the floor during the milking process that has to be hosed off regularly and sent to a wastewater impoundment. But there's also the cleaning of the milking equipment itself, the storage tanks, the piping, the udder, all the things that are used to remove milk from the cow. And those items actually have to be degreased to get rid of milk fat, and then they have to be disinfected according to USDA standards. So all of that wastewater is also has to be disposed of on a daily basis. And for the most part, the dairies in New Mexico send that wastewater to something called a manure solid separator. And the new dairy rule requires everyone to have a manure solid separator. They didn't necessarily all have them in the beginning. And this is to prevent a lot of solids from gathering inside the lagoons and thus eating up any storage space. So there's a manure solid separator. The solids get taken and applied to fields. The liquid is then piped to a lagoon system. In New Mexico, there's two choices on how to get rid of or utilize the manure-laden, nutrient-laden wastewater. And one of them would be to land apply on crops, and the second would be to evaporate in the lagoons themselves. Now, one of the things you need to keep track of for a dairy is any waste milk that is sent to the lagoons has a high biochemical oxygen demand and thus causes a significant, meaning it eats up a lot of oxygen and causes horrendous odors. The other part of the odors that are generated in the lagoons is from the partial degradation of proteins and carbohydrates. So lagoons that are sitting stagnant, they will generate malodors that are then carried into the communities via the wind. In the dairy rule that we worked so hard on, there is monitoring required, and New Mexico is a shining star when it comes to groundwater monitoring. I have to give them a lot of snaps. Every wastewater lagoon is required to be monitored via the groundwater with monitoring wells, with at least one upgradient well and 2 downgradient. And every land application site also is monitored with an upgradient and downgradient well. And New Mexico should be very proud of this reconnaissance of their groundwater quality. And for those that are watching that are not from New Mexico, I will just add, New Mexico owns the groundwater. The state owns it. So it's not the individual landowner. And you must request permission to use the water from the state engineer. That's different in other states. In our New Mexico dairy rule, the groundwater is going to be monitored and analyzed for basically pollutants related to the nutrients of the wastewater, which would be nitrates, total kildol, nitrogen, sulfates, chlorides, and total dissolved solids. Back when we were doing the dairy rule, we looked at some data that came out of NMED, and over half the dairies had violated the groundwater water quality standards for at least one or more of these components. Okay, next slide. So after we've listened to Maria Elena, she lives, of course, down in Anthony, which is just south of Las Cruces. And there are about 13 dairies along the highway. This is the northern section, I believe. We call it Dairy Row, the Dona Ana Dairies. These are multiple dairies just lined up, one right after the other. And there is a nitrate plume underneath all of these dairies that contains nitrates from anywhere from above 10 parts per million to even 100 parts per million. And so the agency required these dairies to go through an abatement process. And Maria Elena and Michael and myself and Sierra Club, we were all involved in the stage 1 and stage 2 abatement process, looking at the plans on how to counteract some of the pollution in the groundwater. What the number one goal is all of the earthen impoundments, the wastewater lagoons that did not have a plastic liner, that were basically just excavated, the plan was to make all of them lined with plastic. And that was going to remove the source of pollution and thus allow for the possibility of reducing groundwater pollution over time. Next slide. Tony, next, okay. So this is a picture of Del Oro Dairy and the city of Anthony, which Maria Elena just lives just west of Del Oro Dairy in that community you see right there. The 2 big lagoons at the top of the page hold their dairy wastewater, and then the dark rectangles with the white stripes, those are the feedlots with the sun shelters. Okay, next slide. This is a little bit different configuration of some dairies located down by Roswell. where the dairies are utilizing their wastewater on center pivot irrigation and growing crops quite close to where their facility is. Okay, next slide. This would be a close-up of the open feedlot showing the animals in the dirt. And then if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, that's the milking parlor for this particular dairy. And in the bottom left-hand corner is the milking parlor wastewater lagoon. The white larger rectangle just north of that lagoon would be the silage storage. And basically what you're seeing is a white tarp over hay with a lot of black tires on top of them. That's what that is. And then there's right underneath the word feedlot in this slide, there's a contaminated stormwater runoff lagoon that's plastic lined. Okay, next slide. This one is an abandoned dairy in Dona Ana. And I put this up here because, you know, not everyone stays in business forever. There's a big question of what happens after a dairy goes out of business. Does the land get reclaimed? Who's in charge of making sure that happens? But here you can see the stormwater lagoons are basically all dried up and crusty. There's some solids on the bottom. And so this was not necessarily a very good closure. But sometimes when a business goes under, they don't have money to close out. So that's something that has to be considered when you look at the industry as a whole. Next slide. Just a close-up of what we're talking about is a plastic-lined lagoon. The black that you see there, that black skin, that's a high-density polyethylene plastic. I believe the rules require at least 30 mil, maybe 40. And right smack in the middle of the slide, in the white area, there's an interesting little rectangular thing. I don't know, Tony, if you can show it with your cursor, but that's the manure solid separator for this particular facility. And they have basically ramps where they're letting the liquid water with all the solids kind of run down a sloped ramp. The water kind of peels off across a weir and the solids collect in the deeper part of the ramp. Then they can take a front end loader and remove those solids and drain them out on the surface. And that's, again, that's to preserve the storage capacity of the lagoons. Next slide. Here is a group of manure lagoons that are not necessarily in good shape. When you have a plastic-lined lagoon, you really don't want any vegetation to grow on it. This particular one on the left-hand side with the half brown, half white, the kind of crusty surface, it has a green edge, which it should be black. So those are some issues out there. I don't know exactly why there's something growing on that particular lagoon, but it's down by Roswell. But it's still, I also really want the takeaway message to be is some of these dairies have extremely large wastewater lagoons. This is the size of a football field, right? And so these are not, when we're talking about leakage from the lagoon into the subsurface, which is the quote, discharge to groundwater, if this was not lined with plastic, then all of this wastewater would go straight into the shallow aquifer and cause potential violation of water quality standards. So it's really good that the industry stepped up to the plate in Dona Ana and said, yes, let's put plastic liners on. And of course, the new rule is what the citizens were fighting for was plastic liners on all new facilities. Now, I think Michael's going to talk later about that. That's not always the case. And so I'll leave that conversation to him. Next slide. Maybe my last slide. Yes, so this is also another abandoned dairy, this one near Roswell. And again, you can see the lagoon, you can see some of the milking parlor sites. So that's really what I wanted to bring to your attention. Some of it looks good, some of it looks bad, but that's the place we're in. This is the industry that's in New Mexico, and it does cause groundwater pollution. Over half the facilities that were monitored during the rulemaking process had violations of water quality standards. And so we do need to see if the new dairy rule that requires plastic liners, that requires better monitoring, that indeed we're seeing a reduction in the violations of water quality standards. That's something we really need to find out. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Kathy. That was a real education, especially for those of us that are not living in either Roswell or the city of Anthony. And it's a really striking visual of especially the city of Anthony and the proximity to the lagoons. So without further ado, we will hear from Michael Jensen, who has also been working on the water quality issues. He's just a step behind that CAFO behind him. We were commenting on your background, Michael.
Yes.
What is that?
That's also Dairy Row, part of the same photo that Kathy had, but sort of upside down with south up top and north on the bottom. But anyway, so I thought I would just talk a little bit about how the dairy rule came into effect, because it informs a lot of the things that we wanted to get into the dairy rule, and then some of the issues that are still out there. So we got some pretty robust public notice in the dairy rule, and that's because a gentleman named Jerry Nivens, who has passed away, but who lived down near Truth or Consequences in that area, he got wind of a dairy being proposed in the area, but he looked and couldn't find any information about it at all. And so he just started driving dirt roads all around that area. And one day at the end of a road, it just dead-ended up against a fence, there was a little notice saying, there's going to be a dairy here. And so he started asking Bureau of Land Management and the Elephant Butte Irrigation District and other people who had absolutely no idea that this dairy, which is named the Parasol Dairy, was going to be put into the watershed of Percha Creek, which, if you stood on the site where the dairy was going to be, you could just look in a straight shot down to the Rio Grande. And people were really upset about it. And pressure was put on the Environment Department, and they denied the permit. The first dairy in the history of New Mexico to be denied a permit. And that raised a huge furor, and the NMED revisited the permit, and they granted the permit, but with a lot of conditions on it. And that dairy never got built, but the industry was so pissed off that somebody would deny a dairy in the watershed of a creek that fed into the Rio Grande, source of irrigation water for downstream farmers, that they went to the legislature in 2009 to get special rules for the dairy industry. And the legislature said, sure. And that started the process, and there were stakeholder meetings in 2009, and the Environment Department came out with a draft rule, and the dairy industry threatened them with litigation because they weren't included in creating that draft rule because they refused to come to the public meetings and participate. So there was another round of stakeholder meetings that I was involved in, and Kathy, Jerry, Dan Lorimer from the Sierra Club, which, the Sierra Club and Amigos Bravos and others had helped on the permit process for Parasol in the first case. And we had this protracted negotiation with the dairy industry. And so that's how the rule got started. It took several years to get a final rule. Each time a rule was made, the industry intervened and fought it, and we had to go negotiate some more and negotiate some more. At one point, we thought we had a final rule, and then we discovered that the industry had been going up to Santa Fe to talk directly with the Environment Department about changing it. Just months after they had signed off on it, agreeing that they would abide by the rule. And so that triggered the last round of negotiations, and we ended up with what we've got now. So it was a long and complicated process, and it was one that the industry started, and the fact that they fought it so much indicates that the reason they wanted special rules for themselves is because they thought that they could write them themselves. And that turned out not to be the case. And it's really enlightening that in the last round of negotiations, when the Environment Department, this is under Susana Martinez, wouldn't meet with all of us at the table together, which is how the negotiations had always happened before. They insisted on meeting with the industry in the morning and the Citizens Coalition in the afternoon. And we said no, and we refused to participate because we wanted to know what the industry and the Environment Department were talking about. But they recorded it. And a couple of times during that morning session, people from the industry bemoaned the fact that, you know, in the old days, you know, everything worked so well when industry could just go to the Environment Department and, you know, work out stuff on their own. And that when the enviros got involved, the whole process, you know, just went to hell. So that's what we started with. And that's why we fought so hard to get good public notice, so that people in areas where there's proposed dairies could actually get involved in the process as early as possible and not have to spend days and weeks of their time driving around looking for little notices on fences. During that stakeholder process in 2009, the Environment Department, this is under the Richardson administration, the Groundwater Quality Bureau provided an extremely interesting and useful spreadsheet of every dairy permitted in New Mexico, whether or not it actually activated that permit or not. And in that spreadsheet had, you know, the name of the dairy, prior name of the dairy, current owners, and then it had all sorts of information, depth to water, whether the monitoring wells had been inspected when they were installed, groundwater flow direction, how many monitoring wells there were, whether all of the lagoons had wells, whether the land application area had wells, monitoring wells, all of the exceedances for the lagoons and the land application area, whether there had ever been abatement, what kind of liners were on the lagoons. Just a massive amount of incredibly useful and important information, not just for the regulators, but for us in the Dairy Coalition, and we use that information. So, for example, most of the monitoring wells had not been inspected after they were installed, or they couldn't tell if they'd been inspected after they were installed. So maybe they were installed correctly, maybe they were, you know, collecting water correctly. We don't know. Most of the dairies didn't have reliable information on groundwater flow direction. Well, if you don't know what direction the groundwater is flowing, then you don't know where to put your monitoring wells. And, you know, I have examples, but I don't want to take up time. But there was a really large dairy whose only monitoring well, recording contamination, was supposedly an upgradient well. But there was nothing upgradient of that dairy except wide open land. So that stuff must have been coming from somewhere. And if you looked at the topography of the dairy, it was quite evident that the groundwater flow was moving almost in the opposite direction claimed in the documents for the dairy. And I'm sure that's not the only case. One of the biggest things that we found was I took that spreadsheet and I divided up all the dairies into depth to water brackets, under 50 feet to water, 50 to 150 feet, more than 150 feet. Now, the industry claimed that for those dairies out in eastern New Mexico where depth of water is pretty far, we would never have to worry about water contamination. Well, the data from this spreadsheet showed that, yeah, pretty much every dairy who had water underneath it, you know, under 50 feet, had already contaminated that groundwater. And more than half of them in the 50 to 150 foot range had already contaminated groundwater. And at least, I can't remember the exact amount, at least a quarter of the dairies with groundwater more than 150 feet below them had already contaminated that groundwater. And you have to remember that most of those dairies in the eastern part of the state are pretty recent compared to a lot of these other dairies in other parts of the state. So they haven't had nearly as much time to contaminate, and they'd already gotten down 150, 200, 300 feet. So this spreadsheet was incredibly useful. And when the Martinez administration came in, they stopped updating it. And now the only way to get information about dairies is to do individual Inspection of Public Record Act requests for each dairy. And as Kathy pointed out, there's 130 plus, you know, dairies in New Mexico. So it would be incredibly useful, and we would think for the agency too, to update this spreadsheet and have all of this information in one spot where they could assess how dairies are doing, if they're improving, if they're not improving, and all that sort of stuff. Now, I'm probably running out of time.
Yeah, we'll go one more minute and we'll do Q&A.
A couple of things that sort of need to be dealt with. I already mentioned we really need to know for each dairy what the true groundwater flow direction is. We really need to know if the monitoring wells are actually functioning properly. Because one problem with monitoring wells that aren't put in correctly is that they can, or not inspected regularly, is that they can not be collecting fresh water, and you're just, you know, testing the same water over and over again. When you look at dairy permits, they are one of the little pieces of information they give is how much TDS, total dissolved solids, there is sediment there is in the water. And some of the dairies have very high TDS. It's above the standard. And I've asked multiple times for different dairies, I've asked the permit writers if that number is from when the original dairy went in, or if it's when the dairy changed ownership, or is it from, do they just update it each time they write a new renewal permit? I mean, where does that number come from? And none of them have ever been able to tell me where those numbers come from. And so you have dairies in very close proximity to each other with extremely wide variations in the TDS amount. So that's another concerning thing, because if they just accept those numbers, they're never going to hold them accountable for that. And then the Environment Department, this is not just for dairies. The Environment Department needs a lot more money to fund people who can go out and do the regulation, who can monitor the dairies, check up on the reports that the dairies consultants put in. Right now, they just take those reports, they file them away, and nobody knows what's happened. And it's for dairies, it's for mining, it's for oil and gas. We need huge increases in funding for those agencies so they can write better permits and do better monitoring. And yeah, I could say other things, but oh, one more thing. This is relevant to Dairy Row. And in 2009, in the middle of the stakeholder process, there was a legislative finance committee meeting down in Dairy Row, and Dan Lorimer from the Sierra Club and I drove down there and went to that meeting. And it was extremely enlightening for two things. One of the dairy owners, who's now gone out of business, he got up there in front of the legislative finance committee members who we met at a dairy, and with a bunch of people around, and he said that it wasn't the dairies that contaminated the groundwater. What was causing the contamination, the nitrates in the groundwater, was that all of those colonias in the area were collecting 50-gallon drums full of human waste, and they were leaking all over the place. Mind-boggling. And then the other really enlightening thing that happened is that a New Mexico State University Ag Extension person who works for the dairies, he actually came from California when a lot of the dairies moved here from California. And he was an expert witness for the dairies. At that legislative finance committee meeting, he said, well, back in the old days, before we knew better, we thought that manure-lined or clay-lined lagoons were perfect and they were fine. But we know better now, and we know that they need to have plastic liners in them. And actually, he wrote a paper about that, which we use as one of our technical documents. But when he testified, he said that clay lagoons were okay. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Michael. Wow, there's a lot to this story, and we have about 15 minutes left for questions, and we have collected a number of questions from participants, and I will read them off to panelists, and we also have a Q&A section below. It should be at the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom screen if you've joined us on your computer to ask a question. And we will go through as many questions as we have time for. So the first question I have is for Maria Elena. Having lived in Anthony for many years, how has Dairy Row changed the agricultural nature of your community? Before Dairy Row, wasn't Anthony an agricultural community organized around an industry producing crops from the ground? Were Anthony residents troubled by the groundwater pollution problems?
That is correct. We used to be an agricultural town. We kind of semi-are, but the employment of these dairies has changed the scope of the how business is done. There's not as much agricultural being done as much as dairy workers going to work daily. And I believe it may be for the worse because of what the dairies have brought in. Like I mentioned, the flies, the odors, and a lot of people understand about what it means to have a job, and they need the jobs. It's a low-income community and mostly Spanish speakers, and that has affected who is here. So it's been quite a change for the community. And I don't know if I answered the question, but.
Yes, I think so. I think we're all trying to get an understanding of how your community has been impacted. So we have another question here from the Q&A, and it's, how is the solid manure disposed of after it is separated from the liquid waste? And is the solid manure removed from the feedlots too, or does it stay on until stormwater washes it off? And I think that's a question for Kathy Martin.
Right, good question. So in other parts of the country, I don't know why I'm not on the speaker view. Margaret, maybe if you, anyway, whatever. In other parts of the country, the permit application requires the dairies to show where they're taking the manure, and they do that through a nutrient management plan. The solid manure. But in New Mexico, that's not the case. New Mexico just looks at the liquid wastewater as a discharge by leakage or seepage into the groundwater. But the manure is scraped from the feedlots and land applied on crops locally, but there is not a mechanism to record that or to keep track of where that manure is going. So that is a big difference. And I had arguments with the Groundwater Quality Bureau about why they weren't keeping track of that. And I believe they felt that the groundwater permit would be limited to just liquid wastewater. But anyway, that answers the question. I'll be quiet.
Can I jump in really quickly? The dairies often have stormwater lagoons also. They're supposed to collect stormwater that runs off from the dairy, but whether they effectively collect all of the stormwater is, another question. But yeah.
And also, I would add one more thing about the open feedlot system is I know you guys don't have a lot of rainfall, but when you do, it's powerful. And I believe that there is also a source of pollution going straight through the feedlot, through the sand underneath, right into the shallow groundwater, because you're never removing all of the manure. In fact, a lot of the cows are sitting on what we would call hills of manure, where they can get up out of the wet muck, where their feces and urine has blended together. And of course, wherever they're eating or drinking, the animal tends to urinate at the trough. So there's areas where there's higher concentrations of urine, which would be a source of nitrogen. And if you have, during your rainfall events, those items, that pollution would go straight down if it did not run off the feedlot. Does that make sense? And there's no control over that.
Right, thank you. So I have a question for Michael Jensen, and we have a question here from the Q&A. Why do dairies go out of business, and then what happens?
Yeah, actually, I see there's another one from the same person. I can just sort of answer all of that maybe together. So there have been dairies in New Mexico for a really long time, 100 years probably, or longer. For example, in Albuquerque, in the north and valley, there were a lot of dairies. And when the Albuquerque started moving north, some of those dairies, well, they consolidated, because it's hard to be a dairy farmer, and some of them consolidated a bit. When the city started moving north, they moved to like the South Valley, where it was a lot more open. And that's sort of the answer. The big answer to the questions is dairies are located in places where land is cheap, and they're not really close to large urban areas, because people don't like to have the smell and flies and odor from dairies. And so, for example, and the dairies don't like to be regulated, which starts to happen when people start building in closer and closer to the dairies, or when the concentration of dairies gets big enough that people who are already there and could tolerate 1 or 2 dairies start to get really upset when there's 10 or 20 dairies. And so in California, for example, there was and still is a really big dairy industry. But when the Los Angeles area started expanding out into the valleys sort of passes, through the mountains and stuff, they started getting closer and closer to these big dairies, and there started to be regulation, and the dairies sold out to developers that made a lot of money and moved their operations to New Mexico. A lot of the dairies in the eastern part of the state are because of that. And land was cheap. The climate is really good for dairy cows. They can get more milkings in general from cows here than they can in a lot of other places in the country. So it's good for them. And so that's partly, why they get located in different areas. Some of those dairies, went to Idaho, some of them went to other places. So you see these upsurges in numbers of dairies in different places as existing dairy concentrations start to be regulated because they're, urban areas have gotten closer and closer to them. Now, why did they go out of business? Well, most of the dairies in New Mexico that go out of business are smaller, sort of what we would recognize as sort of family dairies. A couple hundred head of cows, a couple of family members and some hired laborers to help do the work. And it's really difficult because dairy farmers don't have control over their prices. They're partly dictated, and there's a lot of factors that impact them. Half the costs for running a dairy are the feed, and so they're highly dependent on fluctuations in the costs of things like alfalfa and hay and other stuff and supplements. And so that's largely why those really large dairies in the East can weather those fluctuations, and they also have some consolidated power to push back a little bit on the prices they get that the little dairies, don't have. So.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm taking a look at the Q&A right now, and I see a couple of questions that I'm going to go ahead and answer. And if any folks here on the Dairy Coalition want to chime in, please do. One question is, have stakeholders considered litigation to enforcing existing legal rights? And the second question, these are questions related to future next steps. Is there legislation slated for the next session we should be aware of? And right now, we are identifying the problem and trying to assess where we're at with current issues and problems with the pollution caused by Mega-Dairies. And we do not have, there's not legislation right now, but there will be follow-up conversations. And we will be providing our contact information at the end of this panel discussion. And we will also be following up with folks who RSVP'd and attended. So you'll be aware of future conversations about next steps. And then I realize we're in our last few minutes right now. And so I think we can ask one or two more questions. And one question is that herd size is very large in New Mexico, but Kathy mentioned in her presentation that we actually do not know in New Mexico how many animals are in production at one facility based on that herd size. And the question is, what does that mean? Why do we not know how many animals are at any one facility?
Okay, probably the better question is, why do we want to know? And all of the engineering design factors for estimating the amount of manure generated by a cow is based on per head per day. So there might be a design factor of 20 pounds of 20 gallons of manure per head per day for a dairy cow. Well, then you need to know the maximum number of head of cows on your facility in order to determine the maximum amount of manure you're generating. The way New Mexico Environment Department does it is they ask the dairy industry, how many gallons of wastewater would you like to discharge? Okay, and so the number is just thrown out, 20,000 gallons per day, 50,000 gallons per day, without any reference as to whether or not that is actually a reasonable amount of wastewater generated for a 2,000 head facility. So that makes sense. It's in order to double check their estimates, engineers need to know the number of head of animals because all the design factors are based on by head number.
That does make sense. Thank you so much. And we have one final question, and we're going to ask this question to Tony, who is also going to be concluding the panel discussion today. And The question is, what motivated you to get involved in this work? And can you tell us a little bit about your story, Tony, with Animal Protection of New Mexico?
Awesome. Thank you, Margaret. Yeah, so I started getting involved in this work because I was interested in improving my personal health and wellness. When my son was born, I had lots of health issues. And so that kind of led me on a journey of, nutrition and healthy eating and improving my health and wellness. That research ultimately led me down a rabbit hole, if you will, of learning about how all these other social determinants impact our health and wellness, including public health, public health measures, the environmental health. Our zip code is a bigger indication of our life expectancy than anything else. And so that just like really led me to be really passionate about community health and about, how can we work to empower folks to, take back power of their health. Through all of this, that eventually led me to really looking at how our coexistence with animals impacts, our environmental health, and all of these factors as well. And so I realized that my food choices are a place where all of my passions and activisms intersect, for my personal health and wellness, for the health of the planet, for the animals, for food justice and social justice and worker rights and all of that. That's where, for me personally, plant-based eating really comes into play, and something that, we can all do is to, put more plants on our plates, put less animal products, and thinking in terms of that. So thank you, Margaret, for asking that question and allowing me to share a little bit of my story. And then I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us. Send a huge thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your expertise and experiences. That was really powerful. This is the end of our webinar, but it's just the beginning of the discussion. So we wanted to just share, a few items for moving forward, which are, some of our moving forward actions: legislative review of the dairy rules ability to improve groundwater quality by evaluating the groundwater monitoring well data from permitted dairies before and after the rule. Tracking the number of dairy cattle per facility and develop viable design factors to predict amount of solid manure land applied within New Mexico, and to understand the volume of wastewater generated during the milking process. And then we can learn more about changing your buying habits and alternative sources of nutritious food. Again, just a quick thank you to the sponsors: Animal Protection New Mexico, Rio Grande chapter of Sierra Club, Food and Water Watch, and Socially Responsible Agriculture Project. And with that, again, thank you all for joining us. We hope that everyone will leave here energized to continue the conversation and take action to improve health outcomes and quality of life for everyone in our state.
Thanks a lot, Tony. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you, guys.
Bye, Maria Elena.
Thank
Bye,
you.
friends.
Thank you. Have fun. Enjoy your day.